Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the sixth of our Westminster faith debates on trends in religion and values. We've had a tremendous set of debates, and I'm going to say a word or two right at the end before we close this evening about the thoughts we've had about the future and what we could do to take it forward and so on, and in particular how we'd very much welcome your own thoughts and ideas for us to reflect on and where to go. But as this is the last of this first six, I just want to begin with a couple of thanks to people for all the work they've put in and support. First thanks are to the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Economic and Social Research Council, who have funded the Religion and Society programme, directed and led by Professor Linda Woodhead on my right, which has both done £12 million worth of research over the last 5 years and has funded these particular events. And I'm particularly glad that Professor Tony McHenry is here this evening from Lancaster University, sitting in the corner there, because when he was on the working for the Research Council, engaged with the Research Council, it was his idea in the first place to have the Religion and Society programme. And Tony, I hope you'll think this is a worthy fulfilment of your idea when you were there. I want to thank Lancaster University, where Linda is professor, but also her colleagues, Rebecca and Peter, who have actually organised so much of this so very effectively. And it's actually been a major burden, much more so than we anticipated. These lectures and events have been far more popular than we expected, and there's been a massive amount of work that's done. So I'd particularly like to thank them. There's Peter just coming in the door at the back, and Rebecca's hiding away in a bright red jacket just there. But I really do want to thank them for the work they've done, which has been really tremendous. I want to thank Theos, whose director, Elizabeth Hunter, is somewhere here, who's been helping us, there she is at the back, who's been helping us do the media around this and put the resources of Theos at our disposal. And Elizabeth, we very much appreciated the time and energy that you've put in. And the support we've had also from Coexist, who've helped fund aspects of what we've been doing. For those of you who are avid tweeters and twitterers and so on, I'm constantly corrected in not getting my language right, but you have to tweet, is that right, Elizabeth? WFD12 if you want to participate in this, WFD12 hash, or hash WFD12, whichever way around is appropriate. We're going to have a book launch after the event this evening of a book which Rebecca and Linda have co-authored, and I'll say a word about that at the end as we proceed as well. As I say, the format of the evening is I'm going to introduce Linda, who's going to introduce Grace, and then Linda and Grace will make presentations from the research they've done over these years on what's happening to religion, what are the trends that are taking place. And then Aaqil Ahmed and Cole Moreton will respond to those presentations to stimulate discussion. I will then throw it open to the floor for comments and questions. There's a 10-minute limit on all of the speakers, and I try and terrorise the speakers by holding up these traffic light signals at various points to make sure they stick to it, and I'm absolutely sure that they will. Professor Linda Woodhead has been directing the programme, and Linda, your leadership has been what's brought us to where we are today, and congratulations on your work. I'll say a word or two more about when I introduce your presentation directly, but Professor Linda Woodhead.
Thank you, Charles. So our topic today is religion and values in Britain, how they've changed in our lifetimes and how they're continuing to change. I'm not sure if we've got in the audience, is David Martin here? David. David Martin, I hope I'm not embarrassing him. We're very lucky to have with us because he is one of the most important of commentators on this topic since the 1960s. Very occasionally, a whole field is dominated by such a deep consensus that it becomes invisible to those who propound it. And it's been rather like that in the social sciences in general, and the sociology of religion in particular, through from the 60s to the 90s. And the consensus, as many of you will know, was that secularisation, the process by which religion disappeared as societies modernised, that was inevitable and inexorable, and that's what we were living through in countries like the UK, developed countries. Well, occasionally, and this is why I wanted to check if David was here, there's a maverick voice who points out that the consensus might be wrong. And this was David. David said two things of really profound importance. Whilst not denying that religious decline could and does happen, he argued that when it did, it was due to very particular historical circumstances. For example, if you compare the situation of religion in France and the USA, you have very different outcomes, one much more secular than the other, because religion had very different historical alliances with politics and so on. And David saw that the secular wasn't just an absence of religion, but an alternative ideology and system of values, or several systems of values, actually. So it's not that the religious just rolls back to reveal a secular bedrock. The religious and the secular are competing cultural positions. I can illustrate this with Charles here on my left. When we began this series, Charles used to introduce himself to people by saying, "I'm not a man of faith." And I always said, Charles, you can't say that because you're a man of profound faith. Charles believes in social amelioration through political effort, which is a very strenuous and hard thing to believe in, harder than the virgin birth, you might say. But going back to David, even rarer than the other things he did is to live long enough to see your theory proved right. Because since the 1990s, there's been a growing turn against secularisation theory and a lot of talk of desecularisation and post-secularity. And that leaves us with the question, how are we now to look, really look, at the religious landscape, freed from an obsession about religious decline, and what do we see when we do look? What do we see in terms of religion and secularity, and are those even the appropriate categories through which to look? So that's what we're going to be looking at tonight, and to help us do that, we're very fortunate to have Professor Grace Davie, Emeritus at Exeter University. Grace is known in particular for her work on religion in Europe, in which she's pointed out the continuing but altered role of the churches. And two of her most important arguments are summed up in two of her very memorable catchphrases. First, that we now believe without belonging. And second, that the church's continuing role in Europe can be understood as one of vicarious religion. They do things on our behalf, which we appreciate, even though we might not any longer want to belong. But she has other things to say too, and she's going to say some of them tonight. So Grace, over to you.
Thank you, Linda. This is rather daunting, but never mind. I will use my 10 minutes as follows. We're going to have 7 chronological minutes, 1 each decade, and 3 thematic minutes. In the chronological section, the most important bit, I want to capture the essence of each post-war decade, concentrating on a key date, capturing a date. The aim is to contextualize the current debate about religion and to emphasize continuity as well as change. A sub-theme, an important sub-theme, concerns the limitations of social science when confronted with religion. So the 1950s were a conservative decade concerned with restoration and rebuilding. The key date must be 1953, the coronation. But did the coronation reflect a consensus, or was it an attempt to create one? Sociologists differ, as they will about the Diamond Jubilee. The 1960s brought about radical change in both society and the church. Here, for me, the key date is 1969, when the Americans landed on the moon. For me, this represents the height of secular confidence. Man, it was man, can do anything. And note that this is the decade in which the social sciences come of age, underpinned by a markedly secular philosophy of science. This has important consequences for our readings of later religious trends, because social science expects the secular. But in the 1970s, the mood changes, reflecting growing uncertainty, both economic, that's the oil crisis, and cultural. Are we masters of our fate or not? The key date is 1979, Mrs. Thatcher, of course, but much more important, the Iranian Revolution. Because with reference to Iran, note both the reassertion of religious certainty, fundamentalism in that vocabulary, but more important for this tonight, the failure of social science, or indeed anyone else, to anticipate the shift. No one expected a revolution underpinned by conservative readings of Islam. The 1980s epitomized neoliberalism and the rolling back of the state. Here, for me, there are two rather different dates. I permitted myself two. 1985 is Faith in the City, the Church of England's challenge to neoliberalism, and 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Regarding the latter, communism, which is a secular narrative, implodes, once again contrary to expectation. And the politics of ideology mutate into the politics of identity, in which religion finds new significance. Just pick up the role of John Paul II in this narrative. The 1990s follow 1989, and they become the decade in which the New World Order is configured, including the building of Europe. Here I've chosen 1992. The Treaty on European Union is signed in Maastricht. Are we or are we not part of Europe? In terms of religious trends, we most certainly are. The whole of Europe is experiencing similar combination of factors as ourselves. The renewed significance of our Christian heritage. Why are we provoked? The decline of Christendom and the parish model, which I call a public utility. The shift from obligation to consumption. The growth of a market with gainers and losers. Who are they? And the advent of new arrivals, Christian and other, mostly from the global south. And the re-emergence of religion in the public sphere as a consequence of this, and the frequently sharp secular reactions. All these are happening at once in our country, but also all over Europe. But if we fit in well to Europe, Europe is an exceptional case in global terms. It's not a global prototype. We need to readjust our question. Is Europe secular because it is modern, or is Europe secular because it's European? Appreciating the latter point leads to a more apposite set of questions. So to the new millennium, the 2000s, in which hopes are dashed very quickly. We have to take 2001, 9/11, as our key date. All of us remember where we were on that fateful day, and we all knew that the world would never be the same again. And at last, some of us are beginning to, by this stage, to appreciate that it might be wise to pay greater attention to the place of religion in the lives of individuals, communities, and societies. I'm going to add an additional date, 2005, which is the death of John Paul II. Who went to the funeral? Everyone, except the Chinese. 4 American presidents, and including from Britain, Prince Charles, the Prime Minister, and the Archbishop. This was unprecedented in British society. So we arrive at the current debate. Is God back, or did God never go away? In my view, both are true. The world is most certainly a very different place, but the revolution regarding religion lies as much in the perception of public commentators as it does in the realities of the modern world. A statement which takes me to my 3 thematic minutes. Different things are happening at once in Britain. At one and the same time, the process of secularization continues, at times remorselessly, leading, amongst other things, to low levels of religious literacy, which worries me. But religion returns to the public agenda for the reasons I've outlined above. The outcome of this paradox, and it is one because those two things are not connected, is a debate about religion which is both ill-mannered and ill-informed. At precisely the moment when we need them most, we are losing the vocabulary, concepts, and narratives that are necessary to talk intelligently about religion. What can be done? I would say again the crucial importance of RE, echoing the Archbishop's Easter sermon and an earlier debate in this series. To conclude, there is, it is clear, both continuity and change, from a coronation to a diamond jubilee. I'm going to leave you with an analogy which may or may not be helpful. Unlike all analogies, should not be pushed too far, but it provokes. Here I'm speaking mainly about Christianity, forgive me, but it has moved in the post-war period from something approximating a conscript army with large numbers of people involved, whether they liked it or not, to a professional army which people joined voluntarily, sometimes for a short period and sometimes for longer. Broadly speaking, I contend that the professionals are rather more committed than conscripts. Does that make us more or less secular society than we were in the 1950s? I invite your response.
Grace, that was tremendous. Thank you very much. What it sparked in me is the absolute awareness that we have a duty to look at these great social trends with an objective eye and to understand what's happening, and in particular not to believe that everything just remains unchanging. Things are changing, and we have to understand how they're changing, why they're changing, what's happening. And your chronological sequence brings that out as clearly as anything I've heard. Thank you very much indeed. It's now a tremendous pleasure to introduce again Professor Linda Woodhead, who's going, apart from having given her overview, to give her own talk on this key issue. I think it's fair to say that Linda is one of the principal academics studying religion in society across the whole of the world. She has a wide number of visiting professorships in different countries. She's published immensely widely. She's extremely well respected. She is a professor of sociology and religion at Lancaster University. She's widely published, as I say, and she's been a tremendous driver behind the whole of this whole exercise. She is absolutely passionate about our need to understand the way in which religion is developing in our society, and I really look forward, Linda, to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Charles. That's very nice of you. If you go and look for the religion section of almost any bookshop in Britain these days, you'll find that it's been subsumed under mind, body, spirit. The reason is simple. What we call religion has changed dramatically, particularly, I think, in the last 30 years. I think the change is so significant that we can call it a de-reformation of religion. In other words, the main features which have characterised religion in Britain since the Reformation of the 16th century have given way. For most people, religion has ceased to be a matter of belonging to a clerically led community, affirming dogma, participating in prescribed rituals, and holding conservative social attitudes. It's transformed into something else. Let's start in looking at that, at what's happened with rituals, both national and personal. From the Hillsborough disaster onwards, the Church has gradually ceded control. It still has a role to play, but by the time of Diana's death, that role had become secondary to popular practices and innovations. Similarly, the Church's hold over birth, marriage, and death has weakened dramatically in the last 30 years. Religious belonging, that's transformed as well. It used to be about belonging at the local level and national level. Now it's become a matter of association with like-minded people by way of real and virtual networks which transgress local and national boundaries. So a British Muslim, for example, may associate face-to-face with a few like-minded friends, spend a lot of time reading and chatting on the web, feel part of a global ummah, and long to go on Hajj. And you can say something rather similar about young Catholics, evangelicals, neo-pagans, and others. The statistics on church attendance confirm this. Between 1950 and 1980, church attendance halved. And between 1980 and 2005, it halved again. It's down to 6.3% of the population. We don't want to belong like that anymore. Doesn't mean we're necessarily individualistic, but we associate in different ways. What we believe, that's changed too. Belief in a personal God roughly halved between the 1960s and 2000, from 57% of the population believing in a personal God to 26%. But over exactly the same period, belief in a spirit or life force doubled, from 22% to 44%. So many more people now believe in a spirit, life force than a personal God. And 41% of us now believe in angels, 53% in an afterlife, and 70% in a soul. All those numbers have been going up. It's often double than when records began. And you can't just say it's a growth in superstition because belief in fortune-telling and astrology, for example, haven't risen. Turning finally to religious identity, we all know that 72% declared themselves Christian in the 2001 census. We haven't got the results from the latest one yet. Yet fewer and fewer claim to belong to a religion, and the number declaring no religion has grown from 31% in 1983 to 51% in 2009, according to British Social Attitudes. And there's a lot more of what I call mash-up religion around. Plenty of Christian Buddhists and Muslim Reiki practitioners and even Christian atheists. Religious identity has now become an essentially contested achievement, forged in an exploding market of offers. So what's going on? Those who've even noticed these shifts have tended to dismiss them by saying that real, dogmatic religion has been declining, leaving people with a muddled and fuzzy residue. I think the exact opposite is true. Turn that on its head and you see it the right way round. Real religion, which is to say everyday lived religion, is thriving and evolving, whilst hierarchical, institutionalised, more dogmatic forms of religion are being marginalised. Religion has returned to the core business of sustaining everyday life, supporting relations with the living and the dead, and managing misfortune. That's why angels, cathedrals, pilgrimages and retreats are all doing well, and why mind, body, spirit has taken over in the bookshops. Why should we be surprised or dismissive about this? In democratic, consumerist societies, we believe that we are responsible for our own choices, and that our participation counts. We don't want to be preached at anymore. We want to participate and test things out for ourselves. Doesn't mean we're anti-tradition. Doesn't mean Christians cease to tick Christian on the census. Doesn't mean young Muslims don't read the Quran more attentively, actually, than their parents, or young Catholics don't turn out for the Pope. We appreciate tradition, but want to discover it and sift it for ourselves and with people we trust. Let me give you a little example. This is Pakistani-Danish Saif, an entrepreneur in his mid-30s, educated to school level only, and he was interviewed as part of a project that we're supporting on the Religion and Society programme on everyday Islam in Europe. Saif abandoned the religious practices in which he was raised in favour of Thai boxing, Chinese martial arts and meditation. The meditation became increasingly important to him, up to the point when it started to make the traditional forms of prayer in which he was raised start to become more meaningful for him again. Now he says, and I'm quoting from his interview, "When I pray, then I am represented with Allah. I am physically standing on a prayer rug, but I'm actually standing in his house. Before I prayed and then I was off the rug in an instant, because now I'd done my duty, right? Now the prayer can last much longer, because I have an understanding that when I pray my 5 times a day, then I pray to him. Sometimes I tear up because it affects me in a spiritual way, and now I understand the point of living life and what it means that there is a greater power. And I think this is super great, because with being humbled comes a lot of benefits, like I think of all these issues of being a good person. They've all become clearer to me. Pulling back the focus to Britain as a whole, what all this means is that the religious landscape has become vastly more diverse. It's misleading now to think of it in terms of 6 world religions or 9 world religions, pre-packaged traditions into which individuals can be subsumed without remainder. The monopolies have broken down. Religious leaders don't have the same authority. Religious identity is more individual, idiosyncratic, more interesting. The implications of this for every area we've looked at in these debates are immense. How we teach religion, our anti-terrorism policies, how we deal with conflicts over religious identity, how we survey religion, how religion's represented in the House of Lords, to take a topical example, and what sorts of religious actors and groups are now making a contribution to welfare and health and society. The tragedy, and I think it really is a tragedy, is that we continue to asphalt over all this change and variety with simplistic understandings of religion rooted in the past, and all too often projecting even then some sort of distorted, fundamentalising understanding of what religion is like or was like. The effect is to let religious and secular extremes get away with it, get away with telling us that only dogmatic, conservative, totalising religion is real religion. It isn't. And it's time to stop dwelling on minority extremes at the expense of the middle ground majority, which is to say, most of us.
Linda, thank you very, very much indeed. Linda, that was tremendous as an introduction to the conversation that we're going to have. It's absolutely tremendous. As I said, I'm now going to ask Aaqil Ahmed and Cole Moreton to respond. Firstly, Aaqil. Aaqil's done us a great favour this evening because he's from Bolton and he supports Bolton Football Club, who are playing Tottenham, and he always goes to watch them. But today he said no, he'd come and be with us, so we really appreciate it, Aaqil. It's a tremendous thing.
All pray for victory, yeah.
And he's just said we can all pray for victory. Well, I can name the supporters of a number of other teams who won't be praying for Bolton's victory tonight, because it's a very hard-fought battle down there at the bottom of the Premiership, which I'm glad Norwich currently doesn't occupy. Aaqil is the commissioning editor for religion for the BBC, and the reason why we asked him to respond to this discussion is the way that the religion is dealt with in the media is an absolutely central issue in terms of the trends in society and how they operate. Aaqil has to look at that firsthand in his day-to-day work decisions about these matters, and we're absolutely delighted that you're ready to come and join us this evening. Aaqil Ahmed.
Oh, thank you. Well, let's say thanks for the opportunity to add my thoughts to do excellent talks on what are the main trends in religion and values in Britain. Well, my work in broadcasting of religion in Britain has given me, I suppose, 12 years at the coalface of religion on TV, and 10 of those commissioning religion for both Channel 4 and the BBC. Religion has been half of my career, the other half centred around news and current affairs. And I didn't study theology, but somehow I found myself shaping how religion is accessed and presented on TV. And if you'll indulge me, it's through this prism of my professional engagement with the subject that I will talk about today. Now, when Linda mentions that the religion section for any bookshop is usually found under spirituality or mind, body and spirit, I think she paints a picture that many of us in broadcasting understand very well. Before I worked in religion, I made a few documentaries that today we would class as religion, but in those heady pre-9/11 days, they were simply good current affairs stories, from corruption in the halal meat industry to social cohesion issues in England's former mill towns. Back then, though, religion was either Christian worship, ethical documentaries such as Everyman, Heart of the Matter, or Witness, and the occasional odd minority faith programme to mark Ramadan or Passover. Now, for many years, Everyman and Witness were the flagships for the BBC and Channel 4. They were in the heart of the schedules, they won many awards, and they had real impact. Then something started to happen. In 2002, I worked on Everyman, and the films were by and large by then about ethics more than they were about religion. And I think there was a reason for this, as Grace so rightly spells out in her talk. The times had changed and people were more secular. religion on TV meant programming that was unfairly called Godslot programming, or it was more mainstream and about ethics or lifestyle to appeal to an audience that didn't necessarily want to watch the kind of programming that the more religious were interested in. Now, at this moment, 9/11 hadn't really changed our approach as broadcasters, not enough anyway to go from the odd film to really understanding the religious motivation behind acts of this nature. In 2003, I ended up at Channel 4 and was responsible for the Strand Witness, and you know, the common theme here is after I had Every Man and Witness, they were both axed. But we can talk about that later if you'd like. Again, exactly, yes, yeah. Again, it was as if, actually I axed them, but that's a different matter. Again, it was as if 9/11 hadn't happened. I inherited very, very diverse documentaries. One was about evangelical clubbers in Ibiza, and one was about Christian athletes competing in the Commonwealth Games in Manchester. And this is 2003, remember. So it's safe to say that at this moment in time, religion on TV was firmly in the section of the bookshop Linda pointed to us in her talk. But I would actually go further than that. These particular documentaries were broadcast at 5 p.m. on Saturday evenings. I don't think they were in the lifestyle section, Linda. I think they were in the equivalent of the storeroom, hidden away. Why was that? Well, because no one was watching anymore. The trend right then was clearly, this isn't working. But unfortunately, none of us were attempting to understand why. Instead of addressing this disconnect, we simply decided to hide what was, in the documentary area at least, quickly becoming a market failure genre. Now, I say all of this because I've been asked hundreds of times by journalists and students if the events of 9/11 made my job easier. Well, the question is, the questioners always point out the numbers of books available on religion post 9/11, the increase in reporting and studying of issues about religion. Now, there's a trouble with this theory, and the big trouble is, as true as it is in general about the upsurge of interest in religion as a whole in the country, it was a good 2 to 3 years later before Channel 4 delivered the award-winning Inside the Mind of a Suicide Bomber, a film that featured the first interviews on film with failed Palestinian suicide bombers, 3 years before the series Children of Abraham, and a good 5 years after 9/11 before the genre-defining The Cult of the Suicide Bomber, a series which we were just finishing off in the edit suite on that day in July when Mohammed Sadiq Khan and his gang of criminals unleashed all that pain and suffering in London. Now, what happened in those 3 years before Inside the Mind of a Suicide Bomber? Well, Grace puts her finger on it when she refers to low levels of religious literacy, and it's for this reason it probably took 3 years to catch up. I remember actually on September the 12th being in, suddenly finding myself probably the most senior Muslim in the BBC, and as an executive producer in religion and current affairs, probably right place, right time, and being in a Euston station, explaining to a senior manager at the BBC the concept of suicide in Islam and the notion of why martyrdom is used by the perpetrators to describe their act. Now, not this manager's fault about not having a clue what I was talking about, but because again, why should they know this detail? But I also remember having a conversation about the scheduling of a film about the 4 patron saints of the UK whilst at Channel 4, and casually offering either St George's Day or All Saints' Day as possible transmission dates. Once we'd established a tumbleweed floating past our desk, I put these very intelligent and incredibly supportive colleagues out of their misery by giving them the actual dates. And we can have a quiz after if we want about what they are. Now, a lack of literacy, though, doesn't have to mean religion, and good enlightened discourse needs to be sidelined. Once the ideas come in, then there's more interest in the projects. And that's the real answer to the question about 9/11. Yes, it changed people's relationships with religion overnight, but it didn't on its own make my job any easier. Better, more relevant ideas did. Ones that tried to make sense for our audiences, the new world we were now in, and it may have been 3 or 4 so years later, or later I should say, but after that, the trend in documentary making changed across all broadcasters, and in my opinion, it saved the genre from collapse. Now, is this audience religious? Some are, but I bet the majority aren't. They are viewers who, as Grace points out, have low levels of religious literacy, but they want to understand religion as it affects them now that religion has been thrust firmly back into the public sphere. Now, obviously, there has to be a mix of programming that reflects our diverse audiences and their specific needs, be it songs of praise, daily service, etc. But with the more general programming, I think I try, as many of us do, to try and help with easing the lack of literacy. If you think of commissions such as The Life of Muhammad, Seven Wonders of Buddhism, Divine Women, The Baby Born in a Concentration Camp, to name a few, all of these point to this. They're there to help us use history to understand the religion we live in today, and they're also there as great shows in their own right. Now, I'm not that naive to think that these programs will effectively ease the lack of literacy and knowledge in this area, but there's one particular thing, bit of research I'd like to leave you with, which hopefully will shed some light in this area. A few years ago, I put out a series of programs on Islam, from the first documentary of the Quran to a series called The Seven Wonders of Islam, which looked at the faith through the most 7 iconic buildings in Islam. Now, before that week, I decided to have some research done with Muslims and non-Muslims before, during and after, just to see if there would be any change in their attitudes. No surprise that before the week, the non-Muslims generally said they knew nothing about Islam, and the Muslims felt the media portrayed them negatively. After the programs went out, the non-Muslims said they felt more comfortable with Islam and more knowledgeable, and the Muslims felt that this series represented them better. You know, shock horror. Now, after the excellent Easter that we've just had on the BBC, on radio and television, services, documentaries, projects such as the People's Passion on Radio 4 and the Preston Passion on BBC One, we've had similar feedback from Christians and non-Christians. One even referred to it as the live show from Preston as being how religion should be today. So maybe, you know, we could be in the running, one of us could be in the running for Archbishop of Canterbury. But the reason why I think they worked is if you understand your audiences, then you get it right. You won't get it right for everybody, but understanding them is the key. And if we don't understand these particular trends in religion, whether it be audiences or subject areas, then you know we'll be in a situation where in the past the genre was very nearly killed by not understanding. Now, Grace and Linda put their finger on the 2 issues that I, and in fact all of us, must understand. I've talked about literacy, but Linda's point about the new generation who are different to their parents, the professional army, as Grace brilliantly calls them, are what interests me for the future of programming. You know, how do we engage with them? From a Christian point of view, I doubt they're watching Songs of Praise, as our average audience is around about 65. And I'm pretty sure that across all the faiths, this group aren't watching our documentaries in huge numbers either. So where are they getting their information from? Do they want to be served by broadcasters, or do they simply want to talk to themselves? Now, I need to know, as they're a group, I feel we need to serve. You know, we need to bring them into debate without them or us being ill-informed about each other. So I think of all of my output, I think the Sunday morning programme like The Big Questions is more likely to appeal to them. Here they get a voice and a chance to disagree with, as Linda puts it, the traditional mediators of religion. Their opinion on this show is as equal as that of a rabbi or a bishop. The audience profile is very young and it's growing, and I'm not surprised at all because it's one of very few outlets that people have to have this level of kind of conversation. In the mix of my output, it's one of the central planks of this religion strategy. It's not loved by all, admittedly, and for me that's part of its success. But it's an attempt to reach out and engage with a section of the religion audience that I think we've never really engaged with properly before. Now, they're not the only group we need to keep abreast of. We're constantly trying to focus on what works for all our audiences on all our platforms, because obviously no one size can ever fit all. And the super diversity of Britain has made, as Linda quite rightly points out, traditional packages for some, but not everyone, out of date. And again, to quote Linda, religious identity is more individual, more idiosyncratic, and as she says, more interesting than that. So the future trend of religion on the BBC, and I think across most broadcasters, has got to be, we cannot become a traditional package only. We have to understand these trends, and we have to continually adapt and have a mix that reaches all parts, whether it's the traditional, the non-religious, the ill-informed, or the committed. And I don't think it's just a duty, actually it's what our audiences, who are made up of these groups, and more demand, and to get it wrong would be to admit that we're finished. Thank you.
Aaqil, that was absolutely tremendous. Thank you very much. I'm sure you can gather from everybody's response that they were really finding your description of the ways in which the media interrelate with this really interesting. I thought that was an excellent addition to the discussion. Our final commentator is Cole Moreton. He became very prominent in this area when he published his book last year, which I'm sure he'll hold up for you to be able to buy at some appropriate point. He's very good at that. Is God Still an Englishman? He writes for the Sunday Telegraph and has been very much a friend of this series in trying to ensure that that his readership can participate and engage in the discussion that we're having here, because of his own very strong belief that understanding where we are and what our society is doing, where religion is within it, is an absolute necessity in the modern world. We're delighted for your general support, Cole, and particularly delighted you've agreed to come this evening to comment on this discussion. Cole Moreton.
Thank you, Charles. To quote the great Rupert Murdoch, this may well be the most humble day of my life. I'm honoured to be asked to respond to the research by Grace and Linda, particularly Grace's research, because it really did form the backbone for some of the book. You might look at some of it as an attempt to explore the ways in which we do believe without belonging. And actually, I wish Linda had been a bit quicker, because if she'd published 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been a much better book. I should explain something about the title, really, which comes from a quote by George Bernard Shaw a century ago. He said, "The ordinary Britisher imagines that God is an Englishman." He was, of course, an Irishman. Shaw was talking about the imperial delusion that the English, and in time by extension the British, were a race apart, favoured in the eyes of God for upholding the true faith as defined in the 39 Articles, and ultimately with a mission to bring that faith to the uncivilized nations, often at the point of a sword or a gun. These days we leave that to the Americans. Casting around for the last great festival of certainty, the moment when the British seemed to last know who they were and what they stood for, and the church, crown and state were working together as before to present the image of one nation with one God, a monarch blessed by him, and a church dedicated to her service. I settled on an unexpectedly recent event, the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer in 1981. The Archbishop of Canterbury didn't know how right he was when he called it a fairy tale. But this was an event from a time when our culture was so mono that nobody even bothered to measure ethnicity. And kids like me stood in assemblies on a daily basis to sing a Christian song such as All Things Bright and Beautiful, which reminded us of our place, of course. The rich man at his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high or lowly and ordered their estate. Well, I lived on an estate, and I don't think it was ordered by God, because if it had been, the swings might have been fixed. But you see, this is the time period that Linda Woodhead talks about in her submission this evening, a period of enormous change to our population, culture, spirituality, and expectations. To put it bluntly, the old imperial God is dead. Some of us may say good riddance to that, because we were never happy with a creed that yoked Christianity to empire and power. If the British are no longer so sure of ourselves, that may not be a bad thing either. What is certain, though, is that we are becoming something new. I'd like to tell you about somebody I met. I had to do an onerous assignment a couple of years ago for the Sunday Times magazine to explore the notion of Englishness through the medium of the full English breakfast. Call me Robert Fisk if you like, but I was ready to step into the breach, and for some reason the editor thought I was equipped to do so. 7 full English breakfasts in 3 days, from the silver service at the Goring Hotel to the gut buster at Cannock truck stop. Don't do it. But also the Café Polska in the Finchley Road, where they serve dumplings with their fry-up, and the Café Lahore, splendid place in Bradford, home of what the owners called the full Muslim. Full English breakfast, minus the pork, of course, with a delicious addition of keema parathas and spicy beans, which they serve before dawn during Ramadan. It is superb. Finally, we came to the 99p breakfast at IKEA, which isn't. There I met a woman called Sade, who was 22 years old and named after the singer. She had a daughter called London. Sade's grandparents were Irish, Nigerian, and Maltese. Her background was Catholic, African Pentecostal, and atheist. She said, with a certain English understatement, "We have a few rows." Here's the point, though. When I asked what she was, she said, and this phrase has stuck with me, "I'm British. We're everything now." Now, some people have meant that, of course, but what I try to say in the book is that we can choose to celebrate it and explore what it's going to be. Now, Grace speaks of the process of secularization happening paradoxically at the same time as the return of religion to the public agenda. And Linda speaks of the dreadful clanging moment in which religion and secular extremes are shouting much louder than the more extensive middle ground. As participants in this debate, everybody in this room sees that. The nice middle-class Church of England of the post-war years, with its God of the village fete and the Victoria sponge, may have been easy to ridicule, but it also provided a voice of moderation. It has shrunk away. There are still brilliant people, of course, doing brilliant things in the parishes, and indeed they were doing the big society long before Mr. Cameron was in Eton Tales. But as an institution, the C of E no longer has enough money, priests or people to go on fulfilling its historic mission in the same way. So it must find a new way to serve. And the best of its people know this. However, there is no doubt that in terms of perceived importance in our everyday lives, it has shrunk away, which leaves us space. As Linda says, we have a marketplace now in which those who shout loudest and are most certain of their own truths get the most attention. They may be Christians, they may be Muslims, they may be from that strange church of atheism, but they all attract those who are looking for certainty. That's why bishops, and in particular retired archbishops, are drawn more and more towards the same declaration of certainty. You can see this being acted out in discussions on the television and radio, and while I'm pleased to hear and indeed support what Aaqil's doing, too often broadcasters will put up a bishop against an atheist, perhaps with an imam in the middle, and think they're doing religion, reflecting the spirituality of our nation. Meanwhile, the rest of us, in our millions, scratch our heads. Because if you ask people if they believe in a God of any kind, and you take the lowest survey results around, British Social Attitudes probably is a good one, and strip out all those who belong to a church, temple, mosque, or any other kind of religious grouping, then you end up with something like, well, at least 20 to 26 million men and women in Britain who say, yes, they believe in God, but no, they don't belong to anything. Grace was absolutely right and prophetic in writing that and sketching it out, and it's become more true than it ever was. Those people aren't going to church. Some of them, indeed, are watching the big questions. These are the people Linda identifies in her work, and theirs is what she calls real religion. A loose, superstitious, idiosyncratic, iconoclastic spirituality, informed not just by the Christianity that still haunts us, as the Archbishop of Canterbury puts it, but by neo-paganism, environmentalism, Buddhism, and the influence of the many gods we now have, instead of one. In the book, I call these millions this new national faith, if you like, the Church of Everywhere, or to give it its full title, the Church, Temple, Mosque, or affiliated building of Everywhere and Nowhere Baby, because that's where we're at. All rise for the opening hymn, Hi-Ho, Silver Lining. This is a church with no leaders, no money, no need to know what you do in bed. It doesn't exist, of course, except as a way of talking about those millions. But those millions do exist. To ignore them is to ignore the majority. Now, I saw it, you can see it often, I suppose most visibly in roadside displays where people have died. Funerals are a great place to see it. And I stood outside the church for the funeral of Jade Goody in Buckhurst Hill and saw new British spirituality at play. And there were a couple of thousand people outside, and they stood in rapt and silent attention as there were sentimental videos and cheesy speeches by people like Max Clifford, who said she'd been upgraded to a VIP suite in the sky, which was actually quite a nice way of putting it, actually, when you think about it. There was a black gospel choir, there were doves released, and then when churchy bits happened, like the prayers, or bits of business that you must do in the Church of England service, I stood outside with people who, first of all, started texting, then started calling, then started talking. And the church nearly lost it that day, but it didn't. And the reason it didn't was because the priest was brilliant. She had the advantage of looking slightly like the Vicar of Dibley. She knew she was on News 24 and knew that her sermon ought to be, well, homily really ought to be less than 5 minutes, as indeed mine ought to be, by the look at that card. But what she was saying, actually, in talking about her personal relationship with Jade and the Bible passages that the woman had been drawn to as she came close to death, was to say to those people, yeah, let's be your hosts, let's see what we have in common, let's take your spirituality seriously and realize that it is sincere, although it may not fit in. And let's say our thing, but let's hear also what you have to say. And I would say, both to broadcasters and to the mainstream leaders of religious groups, that the challenge now actually is to look around and realise that we do have an ad hoc, idiosyncratic, personalised, new national faith. And those people, in their millions, need to be heard.
Cole, thank you very much. That was tremendous. I think you'll agree we've had 4 excellent presentations, which I hope you've found stimulating and worthwhile, which really do challenge some of the accepted views about the place of religion in society today. Is what they're saying right or wrong? Does it correctly describe the situation? What implication does it have for the way in which all kinds of organisations conduct their lives? I'm going over to the floor. Before I do so, there are a number of people coming in. There are odd chairs dotted around if there are people in uncomfortable positions. But if there's any of you who'd like to come and sit down at the front, please feel free to do so. I'm going to take questions in threes. We've got ladies and gentlemen with mics who'll come to you, and then I'll ask the panel to respond. We've got about 40 minutes for your contributions, and we very much look forward to what you have to say. I'll start firstly with the gentleman down here, secondly with the lady over there in glasses, and thirdly with the gentleman just behind you, sir, just behind the one just behind. So firstly, the gentleman here.
We've talked about...
Sorry, could you give your name, please?
My name is Paul Richardson, and I write for the Church of England newspaper. We've talked about religion, but isn't a similar pattern to be seen in politics and in other areas? Wade Clark Roof, who wrote a book called The Generation of Seekers, said we're seeing a sort of suspicion of institutions. He traced this back to Vietnam and America. Now, if you look at British politics, we've seen that 2 major parties no longer have anything like the strength they had. We've seen all the political leaders at the moment are very unpopular. You've seen the rise of the Pirate Party in Germany. Aren't we seeing a kind of deinstitutionalization of society? And isn't this the wider trend? And you've given us an example of it in looking at religion. And does it have dangers in it? Does it lead to sort of consumerism in religion, for example, and to an inability of religion to work for political transformation and change, social change?
Thank you. Lady there. Just down, yes, exactly.
Thank you very much for those presentations. I work for 3FF, the Three Faiths Forum, and we spend every day in schools and we work with students and teachers, and the repetition of this problem of lack of religious literacy, I think, is a real systemic one. And my question is, what kind of understanding are we building if there's such a lack of literacy and understanding of that complexity in the teaching and also in the resources that are being used in classrooms today? And how do we progress when the teachers themselves don't quite get that we can't make big generalizations and talk about representation in the way that maybe they were taught when they were at school?
Thank you. And gentleman there with dark hair, yeah.
Hi, Phil Rosenberg from the Faiths Forum for London. We bring faith leaders together to work for the good of London as a whole. A couple of related media and faith questions. In the Evening Standard today, there's a headline, Tower Hamlets chief blames Muslim for vote fraud claims, which I find really quite challenging and upsetting in the way the broad brush attack on a faith community. What's the correct response to that? And on the other side of that coin, how does one sell good news stories, particularly interfaith relations, and a lot of good work going on in London around the country, but it's really hard to sell those kind of stories, ones that are more inflammatory and polarising, obviously, often win the day.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Linda and Cole and Grace and Aaqil. Linda.
Okay, I'll just take that one about religious literacy and teaching. And it relates a bit to the debate we had on religious education here. And for me, one of the things that came out from that was one of the findings from Jim Conroy's project was that when religion was taught in terms of the old style packages, the pupils said, I don't recognise, that's nothing to do with me. I'm a Muslim, I don't recognise that. Or as Christian, it's not who I am. And there was a lot of emphasis on the importance of starting where people are. So religion isn't something that the other does. That shouldn't be the starting point. These strange other people have these rituals. One of Jim Conroy's interviewees said, what did you learn from RE? Well, let me put it this way. If a Jew came for dinner, I'd know what to feed him. It's not about that kind of othering. It has to be, yes, about learning things about history and about the nature of historic tradition, but also about what faith is for us, what we believe, whether we're religious or secular. We all have some kind of faith, and engaging in that way with where people are and what they believe, which actually is done very well in primary schools and often tails off later on. But some way of reintegrating that, I think, would fit the kind of religion I've been trying to describe much better.
Thank you. Cole.
Okay, I'm going to leave the question of how does one sell good news stories to Aaqil. That's a pleasure. I'm going to respond to Paul's question about belonging, because I'm broadly speaking, Paul, I agree with you, but there are a number of challenges to that idea, and the one that comes most readily to mind, because I recently interviewed the head of the thing, is the National Trust, which has gone from 2-point-something million to more than 4 million in the last decade in terms of membership. And the reason that that's happened, well, there are lots of reasons, but one reason might be identified as the fact that it has given people a way to express their values, a set of common values. And the National Trust are actually surprisingly explicit about the spiritual dimension to that. There's a campaign going on at the moment to get kids playing it in the open air and to say National Trust areas are places where you can come and do that. But they're very explicit about saying what we're trying to do here is create a safe space in which people can express their spirituality. And it's hugely popular. You might look at the way that Oxfam and other charities have slightly changed their emphasis and their websites to direct people towards buying as a way of expressing their values. So what I'm suggesting is that outside the conventional and traditional clubs and institutions, there are places where people are finding ways of engaging and expressing their values, and it's very popular.
Thank you, Cole. Grace.
I'm afraid I'm going to duck the media question as well and leave Aaqil to do that. But I am interested in the institutionalisation question because, of course, you're right. The shifts in religion are part of a wider trend. Where I'm going to as it were, gloss slightly differently is I don't think we're moving from something that once was good and is now bad, nor do I think it was once bad and is now good. There were good and bad forms of older institutions, some which were stultifying, some which gave stability. Likewise, there are good and bad forms of new ways of doing things, some which can be rather a shallow consumerism, some which can, and religion is one of them. Here I agree with Linda, we do agree quite a lot, is that religion which is chosen is not trivial. Seriously made choices in religion have public consequences and are to be taken very seriously. This is not shallow consumption, and I think sometimes we've got that wrong. So on that point, I just want to echo what you said, but not to put a value judgment on it. On RE, well, don't get me started in a way is what I want to say, but I would like to say one or two things. One is I think we need to really grasp the nettle. RE should not be anything about faith. There is no reason for anybody to be exempt about it. It is an academic subject which should be compulsory and recognised with every other academic subject. A child who has no knowledge of RE is a badly educated child, period. How do you do it? Well, I know how you find good RE teachers. You look on tables, you find the schools where floods of children are doing GCSE and A-level, and you go to that school and you ask why. It might be a church school, it might not. You find those RE teachers, you get them together, and you share good practice. It usually happens in schools not where you've got a stellar teacher, though they are like gold, but where that teacher is supported by senior management. You need both. It's like having a really good religious correspondent in a newspaper. Unless they are supported by the editor, their stories don't get on the front page. I do think there are things to be done, and we need to do them fast.
Thank you, Grace. Aaqil.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about RE. Where do you? Yeah, well, how long have you got? I mean, that's the problem, you see. Basically, the big thing we must understand is there's a complete difference between newspapers and television, and then there's a huge difference between news and general kind of programming. So if you understand all of that, then then it makes life a lot simpler. Newspapers are very different to television. One's regulated, one isn't. I think you can figure out what I'm trying to say there. So in terms of newspapers, they can say what they like about who they like, when they like, and no one can do anything about it, basically. When it comes down to television programs, we're heavily regulated, so therefore, in terms of what we say things from an objective point of view. So with regards to these particular kind of stories, getting good news stories will depend on whether or not they're good enough to get on. Now, in terms of the BBC News, they're more likely to be on, if depending on the size of the programme or the event we're talking about, they're more likely to be on a local news as opposed to a national news bulletin of 25 minutes, because what do you drop to put something on? Now, that's the reality of the situation. Now, with regards to what exists out there, I think there's lots out there. It's just whether or not everybody watches it. My life has been spent for the last 10 years being effectively like an extra from, Monty Python. When people complain about religion, there's no religion on telly, and I say, well, what about this? Yeah, but what about that? And it's literally the old Romans, what they've done for us kind of routine. So I personally think lots of things exist. I think the bigger question is, do we know about them? And two, how do we sell it? It's about what can you sell. Nobody has a right to be in the newspapers, or nobody has a right to be on radio or television. You have to compete. And the only way to compete is to have things that sell. One organisation once asked me about how we've got this fantastic, 3-day seminar, etc., and this is happening, that's happening. And I looked at them and I said, you know what you want to do? Build the world's largest falafel. And they said, why? I said, that's the only way you're going to get on. And then they looked at me and I said, no, I'm being serious. Do something like the world's largest falafel, the world's largest kebab or something. It was a Middle Eastern organisation, obviously you guess now. And I said, because that's the only way you're going to interest a newspaper or a television news station to come anywhere near your event. And once they come near your event, then you can sell them the event. But to sell them event to say, we've got this incredible speaker from Malaysia, it's just going to go in the bin. And that's not my opinion, that's just the reality of the situation we're all in. So marketing is the key, and you have to find a way of marketing to your core audience, but you also have to accept that there'll be certain sections of the media that just won't be interested because they have an agenda and it won't fit in with their agenda.
I think it's just worth adding, Aaqil, to that particular point, that Paul Richardson's point earlier applies to the media as it does to religious organisations, that we've got a greater diversity in the media happening, social media developing a whole series of different channels, which is also an issue as to how this is all taken forward. Okay, further questions. There was a gentleman just in front of, no, he doesn't want to ask now, so you there, 1, gentleman there, 2, I'll take gentleman there, 3. 1 here. Yes, no, you. No, it's in front of you.
Nick Donaldson from the Charity Commission. Many Christians, and certainly myself, believe that the church is simply the expression of people's relationship with Jesus Christ. In Grace's analogy of the church as an army, which I know she said shouldn't be tested too much, but I think it's important to test it a little. Where does Jesus Christ stand?
Okay, there's a challenge. Gentleman there, can you just pass it across? Yeah.
My name is Jan Jans, I'm from the continent, and a moral theologian. I have a question for Grace. I was fascinated by the dates you chose for pinpointing these decades. Now, what about taking a look in a crystal ball and trying to get September 2010 as a moment that defines the future of religion in the United Kingdom? Because I was in Canada and on sabbatical, and the newspapers, even down there or up there, whatever you like, were like, oh, this will be a big failure, Benedict XVI will do nothing, and so on and so forth. And it turned out to be very, very utterly different. And they were looking for explanations all over the place. Didn't find really one explanation, but it was, from the point of view of a visit and the impact of it, an enormous success. Now, is that having impact on religion in British society, or was that a flash in the pan?
Thank you. And the gentleman there.
Thank you. Yes. I want to pick up Andrew Moreton from Wales, soon to be an ex-vicar, because I resigned because I thought my institution was going the wrong way. And I thought the only honourable thing was to talk to it from the outside rather than from the inside. But that's not the point. I want to pick up something that Cole Moreton said about something that, as religious professionals, we all have and all use, and that is our opportunities to contribute to what might be called rites of passage, in particular, marriages and funerals. It is, let's face it, often the only time and place when people will attend any kind of place of worship. We have a duty upon us, I think, and I hope Cole would agree, to make sure that we get it right. And that our own, if we're talking about lack of religious literacy, among many religious professionals, there is, if you like, a lack of social literacy, where what often happens is they're going through the motions to get the thing over with without paying due attention to what the profound things are that are going on in the minds and hearts of those attending. I would also like to say that one of the things which we haven't mentioned as far as the media are concerned, which I know a lot of people have watched, is Rev. Okay. And I think the reason why that has if you like, struck a chord with many non-religious people is that it actually brings the vicars kicking and screaming into the 1980s.
I'm going to go Grace, Aaqil, Linda, Cole. Grace.
The question about the conscript army and the professional army. Well, this is a question of contracting in or contracting out. And I think I would go back to a biblical precedent. I think both of these are you know, what Christ said. Is it a question of who is not for us is against us, or who is not against us is for us? I mean, you can either have the narrow version of who is not for us is against us. That's a bit like the professional army, but don't go too far. The other one is much more like the public utility, the conscript army. Everybody's in unless they have chosen to be out. Both are biblical, both run alongside each other. And in the religious economy of modern Britain, we have, as it were, a public utility and a market. I welcome that. Now these dates and decades, well, you're pushing me on to the next decade. I had 7 minutes, 7 decades kind of thing. We'll see, I'm afraid, is my only answer, whether the visit of Benedict XVI was a flash in the pan or something very significant. I am of the opinion, I think, that I would not like to live in a country that did not give space to those who wished to welcome a leader of that stature. I think that is part of a modern democracy. And anybody who denies that is violating important, as it were, political and moral codes. But I would not like to live in a country in which everybody had to, as it were, pay homage to somebody whom they disagreed with. So it, in a way, is a little bit like a free space for those who wish to express religious views and to honour somebody who they admire, whether for his views or for his position. I welcome that, and I'm delighted that the visit was a success. But Aaqil, I think, covered it in the media, is that right? Yeah. So I think he's probably well placed to say a bit more. Thank you.
So Aaqil.
Yeah, I'm just glad it went right for, you know, on lots of levels. But no, I was looked after all the religious aspect, you know, the services, etc., and travelled around, and just to let you know, we didn't start in any way with thinking we wanted it to be a failure, or that we expected it to be a failure. The opposite, the amount of money and time and effort that we decided at a very early stage to dedicate to this would suggest that you wouldn't put that investment in if you didn't think that it was going to be an important event. That said, you know, it was a very cold day in Edinburgh when he landed, and when we were looking at the sitting there, looking in the gallery in the truck, and we were looking at the streets of Edinburgh, they were a bit thin. And there was a moment when I just suddenly thought we may have to rewrite the commentary and go down the line of it's not been a success. And then he drove along, and people started to come, and then there was that moment, I think, when he went in to see the cardinal in Glasgow, and he came out to receive the flowers from a young girl. And at that moment on, the whole thing just exploded. And I remember later in the afternoon being in Bellahouston Park in Glasgow, and it was like being at a rock concert. And then from that moment on, it never stopped. So I think the key to the success of it on the day was actually, it was always probably going to be successful for a number of reasons. But more importantly, you know, you've got to have a good start. And there was a really good start. And it was just handled brilliantly. And everybody was willing for it to be successful. So in the sense of, you know, that's why I believe it was a success, because people wanted it to be a success, and therefore it happened. People turned out in the kind of numbers you needed for the momentum to build. In terms of what that kind of impact that will have, has it had any impact on what we do in television terms? It probably meant for me that there was a moment that, you know, and going forward, that we could do more kind of big events of that nature if they happen. So the Preston Passion, you could argue, is a direct, you know, descendant of that day and of that week in September, because we effectively realise that big events that bring people together have some impact in the schedule. So in that sense, yes, it's had it. Will it have a longer term effect? I don't know. We don't really know, do we? What we do know is that there are numbers of people growing, particularly from Catholicism, because of immigration reasons as well, and that's going to have some impact on the kind of programming we go forward with. But don't really know. With regards to Rev, I think its success is down to one really basic thing, and that's it's really good. And I don't think it's absolutely relevant at all, whether or not it brings people kicking and screaming into the 80s. I mean, I was shown the scripts for Series 1 and asked to help and advise, and once it was a success, I've never been shown the script since, so that might say something. But it was a brilliant series. And I remember reading the scripts, and I remember speaking to the controller of BBC Two and to the controller of commissioning and comedy, who asked me to look at the scripts, and thinking it's quite metropolitan but really funny. But the scripts were just so good, because if you had, depending on if you had any faith or no faith, it all made sense. You know, people, you know, as it get down on your knees to get your kids into school, and all those kind of things that were going on, and the evangelical Christian takeover of the church, etc., with the coffee night, with coffee mornings, all these kind of things. It all made sense. So the writing was brilliant, the acting was brilliant. And for an audience, for a channel like BBC Two, yes, it's a fantastic success, but let's not kid ourselves, you know, it wasn't a 10 million viewer show. So for its audience, it was a brilliant success, and I think as long as it continues like that, it will go on. But I don't think it had anything to do with whether or not it was about bringing religion into the 21st century or the 20th century. It's just great, you know.
Thank you. Linda.
I want to pick up as well on your point about, death and rituals in general. I'm really fascinated in the way that there's a kind of re-ritualisation of everyday life going on. So we've invented a whole load of new rituals. We're ritually marking every part of life now in a way we didn't before, just since 2001. It's very precise, I think. So if you think now there are rituals around pregnancy, there are naming ceremonies for children, baptism and marriage have got put together. Do the both things together. Have the baby first, then get married. One cake, much cheaper. Yeah. High school proms. Where did they come from? I mean, we didn't have that when I was at school. Marriage. You start with an engagement now. That's become a ritual. You might not get married. Engagement is a ritual in its own right. Marriages have got bigger. Then you can have, if it goes well, you can have a rededication. If not, you have a divorce party. There's a whole lot of paraphernalia now if you Google divorce parties for ritual celebrations of that. And death practices have proliferated and changed. Even, I haven't got time to go into them all, but even if you just look at the practices around the disposal of ashes, first of all, they used to be buried, then scattered in one place. Now you partition them and you do loads and loads of things with them.
Can I just make an important point about that? As a cleric, I cannot be in charge of that kind of service because I'm not allowed to by my institution.
Right.
And I think that is the institution that's getting it wrong.
Right. So the interesting question is, how do the institutional churches relate to these practices? Yeah.
Thank you, Linda. Cole.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I went to a divorce ceremony where it featured a genuine escapologist getting out of a straitjacket. Not sure I should say too much more on that subject. Except say, of course, that if you are a priest working in parish, you have to deal with the reality that if you want to be old school and ask people to come to marriage preparation classes and have their bands read, I don't think you have to do that anymore. But if you want people to commit to the church for a while so that they can get married in your pretty church, you have to deal with the reality that there is a very slick gentleman half a mile down the road in the local stately home or hotel who will say, yes, would you like a glass of chilled champagne with that? And we can do anything you want. That piece of legislation, which at the time seemed so small and insignificant, passed by the major government, has been a huge, huge thing in terms of breaking off the everyday contact between the community and the church, and the implications of that go on. What worries me, I bow to no one in my admiration for Grace Davie. She's a splendid person, and the business of the professional army is right, I think. But what worries me is that what we're looking at is a sort of medieval scene where the professional armies of Islam, Christianity and atheism are having a battle over there on a field while the rest of us are tending our vegetables. And it sort of ignores the rest of us, that. And as for September 2010, I think that, you know, on any given Sunday, there are about 800,000 people in the Anglican Church and about 800,000 people in the Catholic Church. And if you talk in terms of the marketplaces we did earlier and say that those who can be most certain and loudest and who don't have the crippling effect of a fracturing church behind them are the ones who get heard the most, then there is an argument for saying that the Archbishop of Westminster is the leading churchman in the country at the moment. But actually, September 2010 and the Pope's visit, I don't think made a blind bit of difference, to be honest.
Okay, I'm going to slightly widen it because a lot of people want to come in. I'm going to ask, going to take a round of 6 first. So I'm going to take the gentleman over there first, gentleman here. I'm not going to. I know I've seen you, but you've come in on a number of these, and I'm going to allow some of the people who haven't come in before. Stephen Timms right at the back, gentleman over there, final one, gentleman just here on the row. So. We will start off over there.
Hello, I'm Greg Smith, researcher in this field. I just want to get reflections from the panel on the link between ethnicity and religion. You've talked a lot about almost consumer choice and the market in religion, but there is clearly a correlation between ethnic belonging and religious faith. Just to say phrases Pakistani Muslim, Polish Catholics, African Pentecostals, or even the English Defence League and their use of Christian language. There's a clear correlation. How important is that?
Next was just here, I think. Yeah. Yes, here. Sorry, it was right.
I'm John Woodhouse. I run the Interfaith Group at Westminster Cathedral, and I'm also doing an MA in Christianity and Interreligious Relations at Heathrop, and a very keen watcher of religious programmes, Aaqil. And you didn't, in your short time, mention The Sanctuary, which I thought was a wonderful programme about spirituality. And you didn't mention the 3 wonderful programmes about Catholics. And currently we've got Angels of Mercy. Now my idea for you is, I went to the prayer vigil in Hyde Park when the Pope came. I don't think that was on television, which is a great shame because we saw a lot of very good film about what the Catholic Church is actually doing in the world and in social action. And in the Catholic Church itself, people do not know what is going on. There is a vast number of people in this country actually doing the work of volunteering, and that's one area that could be covered, covering all faiths and none as well.
Thank you. Stephen?
I wanted to ask a question about those who are...
Stephen, can you just introduce yourself?
Sorry, Stephen Timms, MP for East Ham. I wanted to ask a question about those who are going to church. Linda made the point the number had halved and halved again. In London, it's been reported that it's now going up. I wonder whether you think the number has sort of plateaued, or is what's happening in London just a blip? And what's the relationship between those people and this much larger group who have a looser faith? Are those people drawing what they believe from the small group, or is the big group sort of self-contained and getting its beliefs from somewhere completely different?
Thank you. Can't remember who was next. Gentleman there was certainly on my list. There, just there, down there with glasses. Thank you.
I'm Edward Jenkins. I am a lay employee of the parish church down the road, St Stephen's, Rochester. First of all, I agree with Mr Timms. The Bishop of London is insistent that numbers are going up in the CEV in London. We're very proud of that, and certainly holding steady. I really wanted to pick up, I think, on what was said down here, and Cole Morton's saying there are 26 million people unaccounted for. It's a truism that goes around C of E circles that it's the only organisation which exists for the benefit of those who are not its members. We provide ministry in all sorts of ways. You must remember this, not just to people who have joined electoral rolls, PCCs and all the other technical gubbins, but to people who come, as you say, to be married, not, I think, as you glibly say, always in a pretty little church, but sometimes in a rather nasty little church, maybe like the one I saw in Hackney the other day. I won't say which one it was.
Okay.
What I want to say is we need to know more about this 26 million and how the Church of England in particular impacts on their lives. It's not just good enough to say there's 26 million. They are very much affected, these 26 million, by the life and ministry of the Church. And I would expect your project to be getting to the heart of the ways in which that happens, rather than just saying there's 26 million unaccounted for.
Okay.
And after all, could I just point out...
Can you just bring your remarks to a close? I'm trying to...
The one last thing is, that funeral of Jade Goodies, it did take place in a church. Why was that?
That was my point. Okay. There are two other people I indicated, but unfortunately I can't remember. I think I'm failing to do it. I'll take the lady there with glasses, just in front. Yep.
I'm Gillian Patterson, Research Fellow at Heathrop College in London. In 2006, I was a member of the programme committee for the International AIDS Conference in Toronto, which is a gathering of about 25,000 people, with around 1,000 events of different kinds. And the previous conference, there had been a huge hoo-ha because there had been a minimum of a very, very small proportion of these events were from religiously motivated organisations, although there had been many proposals. And in my efforts to promote within this committee, this programme committee, some of the religiously motivated proposals, the comment was, oh, but all these things, all these proposals are doing is going on and on and on about all the very good, self-evidently good things that the organisations are doing, and nobody is actually saying what the effect of it is. And I just wanted to say this because I think the work that's being done by AHRC is extraordinarily important. We really do need respectable research that goes beyond advocacy and stands up to media examination and political assessment.
Thank you. Gentleman there, I'd just seen before.
William Acker from Birkbeck College, London. Just wonder how the panel thinks, how important do they think external media that's external to the UK is important in shaping religious values in Britain? And just to give an example, think about a group like African Pentecostals. Why might they be watching the BBC? Because they can access their religion unadulterated via satellite television. Now, is that a phenomenon just particular to specific minorities, or is Britain's majority population that we might construe as being religious, are they also being influenced by external media?
Thank you. I'm going to go Linda, Aaqil, Cole, Grace. Linda.
Okay, I'll just try and address Stephen's question. Christianity in this country, there's been a huge internal realignment that's not usually noticed. So if you break down regular church attenders now, less than a third are Anglican, less than a third are Roman Catholic, and more than a third are a mixture of independent, more voluntaristic, Baptist, African, Pentecostal, charismatic. That's the biggest group now. That's a huge shift in the overall profile of Christianity. And part of the reason London's doing well, part of the reason is because of the success of African-derived churches. And churches which attend very much more to the emotional, to everyday concerns, to healing, to some of the same themes that you see in alternative forms of spirituality as well. But part of your question was also, where does religion come from for people now, and how important are the churches still in that? It always used to be assumed by sociologists that you could only get religion one way, and that was from your parents. So religion was handed down the generations. that ceased to be true now. I think that's one really surprising thing that's come through in project after project on our programme. People now learn just as much from their peers. There's a project about young Sikhs and how they learn about the faith. They learn about it in summer camps, Sikh camps. They learn about it in university societies. They learn about it from the web. They still go to the Gurdwara occasionally to worship. It's not irrelevant, but it's a much bigger and broader package. And that's partly why I think that re-ritualisation happened since 2001. The explosion of the internet and of social media has made a huge change in the way that we learn about our religion. One final remark. I've seen my students change. I've been teaching since the 1980s, religious studies and theology, and students used to be fairly hostile. When you told world religions, they were most hostile to Christianity because they came with a lot of preconceptions about it. Now, they're completely open, they're absolutely fascinated. And if you say, well, Christians believe that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, really? After 3 days, he died, he came back. They're absolutely fascinated, but they're completely open and agog about all these things they haven't heard of.
Thank you. Aaqil.
That is so true. I got into trouble for, was it being accused of, my big scoop on the Christianity of history was that Jesus was a Jew. And I remember one newspaper, tried to poke fun at me at my expense, simply calling me an idiot for that. And I thought, if you were there in the meetings with Oxbridge graduates who went, what's all this Jesus a Jew rubbish? When I explained, and they went, oh yeah, well he would be, wouldn't he? Yeah. So you're right. So there is. Really? Yep. Wow. You'd be surprised. Now, I don't really think it's a question because you're talking about 600 hours of radio, 174 to 76 hours of television a year. I can't comment on every single one of them. I just picked out some particular ones which were relevant to what I'm talking about. And with regards to the Hyde Park thing, I think it would be very undiplomatic of me to go into details as to why we didn't do that. It had nothing to do with the BBC at that time, and there are all sorts of reasons. But I think what you should think about is the amount of events that we did put our money involved in. I won't go into the details of how much money was spent, but I think you can guess it wasn't cheap. With regards to your question about how important is the media from external countries, I think it actually fits in with what I was saying about who are these groups, and we need to know much about them. Do they want to be served by broadcasters, or do they want to be served by narrowcasters? And my honest take on this is right now is that it's narrowcasting. As a senior manager in the BBC, I went out to help collect licence fee from people who don't want to pay their licence fee and have conversations with them about why they didn't want to pay their licence fee. And there were some very interesting conversations with people primarily from Arab, African or Eastern European backgrounds who had very different reasons. If you went to meet a middle-class person from, say, West London, he didn't want to pay because he wanted to wait till someone like me turned up to explain to me why I didn't want to pay that licence fee, and then would get his checkbook out and say, how much is it again? Right at the end, once he'd had... But the other groups said exactly what you said, which is, what's in it for us? I don't need to... one of the funniest conversations was an Eastern European lady saying to me, what is this, the Stasi? I think it's very funny. But the fact of the matter is that, there is, what do they get from it? And I actually think, in terms, just speaking purely as an individual here, I think that for the BBC, we have to fully understand that, because if we do ask people for a licence fee, then in some way we have to give them, something in return. Now, we obviously do in many ways, but for many people who are coming here, what they want, they're never going to get from the BBC, because the BBC is and always will remain a broadcaster. So if they do not want broadcasting, and they want narrowcasting, then there's absolutely nothing we can do about that. They want things in their own language, and they want the kind of religious conversation that we can never have, because we don't have that kind of religious conversation in this country in terms of our broadcasting. And there have been channels which have been closed down for that very fact, and because they are doing things which obviously are in breach of Ofcom guidelines. So yes, they have huge impact. On a personal level, I think it's a shame. I think it's a negative impact. I believe that we should all be talking to each other, and I believe there's a place for these, but there needs to be broadcasting, not narrowcasting, and if this narrowcasting continues, it's not going to be, I don't think it's helpful at all for social cohesion.
Thank you, Aaqil. Cole.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to address the question by the gentleman over there first of all. My point was that the Jade Goody service was in the church. That was the whole point. The church as a servant at its best. Quite rightly, as you say, Church of England exists in some ways for the benefit of those who are not its members. But then again, I wish you could go to parishes where the vicar has turned it into a Bible club and tell him that, because I think that across this country there are a number of different places where particularly evangelical parishes are turning into Bible clubs, and that is a betrayal of the historic mission of the church. And it's, may as well just go and join the Baptists, as far as I can see. But anyway, that's neither here nor there, is it?
Got that off your chest?
Yes, thank you. As far as the wider thing, William down here, Stephen at the back, and the question of our ethnicity. I'm really interested in the fact that kids apparently these days are 5 or 6 times more likely than their parents to be mixed race. So what this means is that within a generation, I mean, if not already, it will be normal British experience to have in your family background customs, habits, aspirations, ideas of God from all over the world, and that is having and will have and will continue to have a huge impact on our spirituality. What a massive difference from what I was talking about at the beginning about all things bright and beautiful. What a huge seismic change that is. And I think that we're moving through a period of cultural identity crisis into a new actual kind of culture completely, in which African Pentecostalism and others will inform spirituality in this country in a new way.
Thank you, Cole. Grace.
May I, just a note about school proms. We had school dances. Well, and I, almost exactly 50 years ago, I went to a school dance with a guy I eventually married. No escapology so far. But more seriously, ethnicity and religion, we didn't address that so far. I think it's a very interesting question because there is a relationship, but it's not a direct one always. And I think one of the most interesting things about that picks up a point I started with, which is that social scientists are much more comfortable with ethnicity than they were with religion, or they are with religion, so they resisted the religious categorizations for as long as they could. And very interestingly, one knows the story of the debate about the religious question in 2001, driven by the community, which is the Muslim community, who do not fit the ethnic category very well. They were too diverse in terms of ethnic background and national background. So Islam, the religious category, became the most important one for them and gradually went into the census. Good for them. I want to say a word about London. I think this London situation is extremely interesting because it's right across the denominations that the rise in the church-going can be seen. It's not one denomination at the expense of others. They are all rising. Now again, these social scientists saw 20, 30 years ago that London was leading us downwards. And the rest of us, particularly rural Britain, were the laggards, but we'd get there surely sooner or later. Well, before we finally made it, London's gone up again, which makes me very cautious about predictions. I really do think the jury's out on the next 30, 40 years. We were wrong too often in the 1960s and 70s. We thought liberal Protestantism would be the gainer, and it's turned out to be the loser. It may well turn again. Just on the question of numbers and the minority and the majority, Linda and I debate a little bit about this, but when she says, 6-point-something% in church on Sundays, it's true, but there'll be 6-point-something% in church next Sunday, and they won't be the same people. There is a bigger pool, and this rigorous statistical analysis is not revealing that, and particularly by people who choose to read it otherwise. So I think a little caution there is a good thing. And I knew this professional army business would cause trouble, but it has made you think. Do remember that I've spent most of my professional life looking at the middle, the believers without belongers, trying to understand their vicarious attachment to the institution. I've done my best. And as a member of the Church of England, I know how effective a parish can be if well-led and well-supported. Now, they're not all well-led and well-supported, and some struggle. But if incredible things go on in Church of England parishes, many of them laudable. And what I think is the not all of them. What I think is the greatest challenge to the historic church in this country is how to ensure the best of the parish model when the resources mean that you can't afford it. In a way, you can't afford to do it in the way that you always have done, but that doesn't mean that you give up entirely. There are new creative ways forward. Let's find them.
Thank you very much, Grace. I'm just debating with myself whether to do another round. We've run past 7 and we've got a book launch, so I think I am going to stop now. I want to say very much thank you to all of you for coming and to the panel for what I think has been an extremely stimulating discussion. Thank you very much indeed.